Some of the hardest things for Christians to defend are God's commands to kill men, women, children, and babies. I'll be addressing some of the most common arguments in this video. Number 1. The culture had evil practices. If you've watched any Christian apologists defend genocide in the Bible, then you're going to hear this argument. When discussing the wholesale slaughter of the Canaanites, they'll usually start by saying that the Canaanites had evil practices, such as sacrificing babies.
What's the answer? What are the reasons? What's been going on in the land of Canaan for 400 years? And God has been warning them. What are they doing? All sorts of abominable practices. They get to the point where they're actually sacrificing their children on a metal idol named Molech, who had arms like this, and there was a fire that they would put in Molech, and they'd heat the whole metal idol up, and then they would put their babies on the arms of this idol and watch the baby sizzle to death.
Frank Turek speaks of Canaanite human sacrifice in a matter-of-fact manner, but there's still a lot of controversy over that. There's a really great documentary covering the topic on a YouTube channel called Timeline, World History Documentaries.
The implication of this, of course, is that this was a very sacred, hallowed ground. What we have is not a cemetery for children that died from natural causes, but a very sacred precinct of ritual child sacrifice.
Glenn Marco may be right, but he admits that only unambiguous scientific evidence will prove conclusively his belief that ritual child sacrifice actually happened.
I think the evidence that would really settle this debate over child sacrifice versus natural burial would be the evidence of the age of the children cremated.
The age of the children when they died is critical because Professor Bartoloni maintains that the Tophet is simply a special cemetery for infants who died from natural causes.
At the end of the documentary, the narrator says that it could be another several years before they can definitively say if child sacrifice is what actually took place. I'll leave a link to the video in the description. But let's say for the sake of argument that the Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians actually were sacrificing babies. Would that be moral justification for genocide? Lots of ancient and medieval cultures had barbaric practices. For example, in Europe, you could be burned alive for witchcraft or for being a heretic, but would that give someone the moral justification to annihilate all of Europe's people? Frank Turek argues that atheists complain when God steps in to stop evil, but what atheists are really complaining about is the idea that genocide was the only possible solution to stop evil. Number 2, the children would grow up to be evil and have a negative influence on God's people. The problem with this argument is that we know children don't always grow up to be exactly like their parents. We all know people in our lives who've had rough childhoods and parents who were less than ideal, but somehow they still manage to become productive and responsible members of society.
Some people's fathers have conventional jobs, like a lawyer or an accountant. But Woody Harrelson's father preferred the art of killing as a professional hitman.
I suppose I do have some kind of thing that's really connected to my father that way. But I like to think I'm a pretty peaceful guy.
Number 3. God used pagan nations such as the Assyrians and Babylonians to punish his own people.
So it's a world of difference. God was judging the nations of Canaan in the same way that he would later judge Israel when he allowed the armies of Babylon to come in and destroy Israel and take its people into exile.
That's not a good argument. All you're really saying is that when God commands violence, it's not personal, which in my opinion is mobster mentality. Just because it's not personal doesn't make it right.
It's not personal, Sonny. It's strictly business.
Number 4. The children are in heaven. The first problem with this is that there's no scripture in the Bible that definitively says that children or babies go to heaven by default. Secondly, even if they did go to heaven, which the Bible does not state, it wouldn't change the fact that they were victims of genocide. Nobody would deny that the 20 kids who were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School were homicide victims, whether they believe they're in heaven or not. Number 5. All of the people weren't killed. Lots of Christian apologists talk about how some of the people that God commanded his people to annihilate have descendants that show up later in the Bible. So they argue that when God says people will be utterly destroyed, sometimes it's just a figure of speech.
That we read, say, in Deuteronomy 7, wipe out everybody, the women, the children, the cattle. That was called hyperbole. Why? Because if you read, it says, wipe everybody out. In the very next verse it says, and then don't intermarry with them. Now, wait a minute. If you're going to wipe everybody out, how could you intermarry? Why would you even have that command in there? Because what Copan is saying is that this was common language in the ancient Near East culture. They would use exaggerated terms to communicate that we're going to beat you. Just like we might say in a fool, we annihilated that team. Oh, really? They're gone?
That still doesn't mean it's not genocide. In America, they're still living descendants of the Native American people, but that doesn't change the fact that they were the victims of genocide. Number 6. If the people had fled, they wouldn't have been killed. That's like if someone breaks into your house with a gun and kills you and your entire family. If they were to go before a judge and say that the whole thing could have been avoided if you and your family had simply fled, how well do you think that would hold up in a court of law? Essentially, you're shifting the blame onto the victims.
Elbowed, she didn't break loose. Elbowed again, she broke loose, and I ran through the door.
But police say Bassford punched the woman on the ground and then threw her down the stairs before making his getaway. Bassford's contention that the homeowner brought the beating on herself ticked off Spokane's new police chief.
We have somebody who breaks into a home to commit a burglary, is confronted by the homeowner, ends up seriously hurting the homeowner, and then gets captured, and then tries to blame the homeowner. I think there's something wrong with that picture, right?
Number 7. God can do whatever he wants. Frank Turek always says, because God created you, he has the right to take your life at the age of 2 or the age of 82. This is a divine command theory. It's an argument from authority. In the film God on Trial, one of the Jews in the concentration camp remarked that God was never good, he was only powerful, which summed up divine command theory perfectly.